All right, this video comes with a disturbing content warning for you Seventh-day Adventists, so beware. Here you go. Here's your Sabbath anxiety warning. This is now the third video on calendars. The previous two have already proven the Seventh-day Adventist doctrine of a 7-day unbroken cycle has been broken, as demonstrated by the two previous videos. If you haven't seen those videos, go watch those videos, but here's a very short review of those videos. Defeating Adventism number 184. It's Adventism is defeated by an ever-changing Hebrew calendar, because when the new moon is not officially declared, as we saw that in the Mishnah, what the Jews did was they added a day to the previous calendar. They changed the 7-day cycle. Then, when the Day of Atonement falls on a Friday or a Sunday, they added a day to a previous month to slip all of the days so that the Day of Atonement did not fall on a Friday or Sunday. And once again, the 7-day eternal cycle is broken. And then there's Defeating Adventism number 185, which went over this calendar here, where Thursday, October 4th became Friday, October 15th. But when you run the dates out, you find that, well, October 15th should be a Monday, not a Friday. So the 7-day cycle was broken once again. Now, as I've been doing all this research on calendars in Adventist literature, I began to notice something. As I'm literally reading hundreds and hundreds of quotes about the weekly cycle in my almost 20,000 Adventist magazines. Adventism started to, I want to say, presumably speak for God. They were putting words in God's mouth by claiming that God ordained a 7-day week for all mankind. And it started in Genesis 2:2. At least I think it started in Genesis 2:2. We'll see here in a minute. Now, really, in a way, this makes sense in Seventh-day Adventist theology. After all, Adventists love to say, Mark 2:27, the Sabbath was made for man. Well, how can a Sabbath be made for man if man doesn't have a Sabbath? If man doesn't have a 7-week, a 7-day calendar, a weekly calendar? He can't. So the Sabbath was made for man, Mark 2:27. Okay, well, it totally makes sense in Adventist theology. And let's look at it here, how they teach it in May of 1886. And I'll just read from the very top. It must be borne in mind that to claim that the correct reckoning of the weekly cycle has been lost since God instituted the Sabbath. In other words, if it's lost, then that is to charge him with folly. For certainly it would be folly for God to institute the Sabbath, command man to observe it, and then allow it to be lost so that he could not know whether he was observing it or not. So if the Seventh-day Adventists are correct, then all world calendars have to be on a 7-day weekly schedule. Otherwise, how can they observe the Sabbath? Adventists, are you nervous yet? You should be getting nervous. You might want to take your anxiety meds about now. So, did God create a worldwide, universal calendar system so that man could observe the Sabbath? We just saw in that Advent Review and Herald magazine that to say otherwise is to accuse God of folly. If God required mankind to keep the Sabbath, then mankind has to have a Sabbath, then mankind has to have a Saturday, mankind has to have a 7-day calendar. Okay, if so, when did God, and this is the Adventist God, by the way, the Adventist false God, when did this Adventist false God create this 7-day week? Let's look here. Let's look at the Advent Review magazine from January of 1880, and by none other than the heretic, anti-Trinitarian, who died a non-Christian, James White himself, who says this: the division of time into weeks of 7 days originated in this great event. And you can see the great event he cites is, well, it's Exodus 20. Okay, so the 7-day cycle originated in Exodus 20. Is that what Adventists continue to teach? Let's look here. Signs of the Times, September 1929, and it says this: when God introduced the weekly cycle at creation, he made it a permanent, eternal institution. Wait. When did God introduce the weekly cycle? Creation. Well, what is it? James White says it's Exodus 20. That Adventist author we just looked at said creation. Adventism can't even keep their own doctrine straight. So I can just tell you from having read, again, hundreds of these, most Adventist authors, if they're not vague in terms of when this supposed 7-day cycle was created, most of them land towards creation. So apparently James White he's kind of out there and he's got it totally wrong. So let's look at other Seventh-day Adventist authors. Now here, Seventh-day Adventism is putting words in God's mouth. Seventh-day Adventism is creating a doctrine which the Bible does not have in terms of this 7-day week. Let's start here with this one here. Advent Review and Herald Magazine, June 1930. One definite and fixed period of time that God gave the world in the beginning is the unit of time known as the 7-day weekly cycle. God ordained this weekly cycle to be preserved in unbroken succession, not only from time, but for eternity. Pretty emphatic statement there, right? God gave the world this 7-day weekly cycle. Didn't they say this in January of 1945? Continuity of the weekly cycle has never been altered since God started the week. There it is. So if we see in evidence that someone has altered a 7-day week, well, then I guess that kind of proves this Adventist God maybe he was sleeping, maybe he was resting. Let's look at this next one here. The weekly cycle comes to us as a legacy from the dawn of history. Now, they don't tell us creation or anything, but it's a very long time. It was ordained by the Creator in the beginning. Oh, there it is. The weekly cycle ordained by God in the beginning. Just like the quote to the left of it, God ordained the weekly cycle. The last one on this page here from 1979 says, thus God founded the weekly cycle, not for his benefit, but for man's. See, there we go, right? Man has to have a weekly cycle to follow Mark 2:27. He carried so much for the two wonderful creatures that he made the Sabbath, etc. So the Adventist God gave the Sabbath to mankind, right? After all, Adventists love to quote Mark 2:27, God, the Sabbath was made for man. So this God must then, if the Sabbath was made for man, this God must then give mankind a universal 7-day weekly calendar to observe what he commands. That's essentially what that one Advent Review and Herald magazine we looked at in the beginning told us. So the question to ask now is, was this 7-day Adventist God successful at instituting this weekly cycle throughout all mankind? Was he able to do it? What would this say if the Adventist God failed to give all people groups a 7-day week? What would that say about this Adventist God? What would an Adventist think about that? Let's look here, Signs of the Times, June 1929, page 12, where this author says this: surely the weekly cycle has come down to us intact, binding it to all history and chronology and giving us an unbroken measure of time. To answer this negatively filled my mind with thoughts of apprehension, for this would throw our whole chronology out, like Sabbath anxiety is what we got here. No, not the Sabbath. Adventists obligate their God to create a universal 7-day weekly calendar for Sabbath observance. Any nation or people group, I want to say, that's not on this 7-day calendar would then by de facto prove the 7-day Adventist God is just weak and ineffective. Okay, it's time. It's time to prove this a 7-day Adventist God who supposedly ordained this cycle is an utter failure. Because that's what history is going to demonstrate and prove to us. There are lots of people groups who do not have, who did not have, who never recognized a 7-day cycle. And all that is contrary to what Adventists say. Let's start right here with this. Right here, let me show you this before I jump to the page. This is a 4-volume set of books. This is a fantastic set of books on the ancient Near East. And we are going to start here as I was doing some calendar research. Now we're going to go to the screen. Now let's look at the book. So there it is, the very same one I held up. This is volume 3 of that 4-volume set. And I love this right here. You can see at the bottom, the 12 civil months were each divided into weeks consisting of 10 days. Our author here is describing the Egyptian calendar. Egypt had a calendar consisting of a 10-day week. Now isn't that interesting? Because who was in Egypt? Well, the nation of Israel spent 430 years, as you can see in Exodus 12:41, as slaves in Egypt. Were they observing the Sabbath all these 430 years? Well, at least the Signs of the Time magazine seems to have got this right when it says the Israelites had been in slavery in Egypt and had not been permitted to observe the Sabbath. So the nation of Israel lived in Egypt for 430 years and under a 10-day-a-week calendar. So much for this God-ordained 7-day week, right? Unless God said the Sabbath was made for mankind, except the Egyptians. Maybe that's in the Clear Word Bible. I'll check it after I make the video here. Now, what was surprising to me in Adventist literature was that they recognized people groups in their literature who didn't either have a 7-day week or didn't even know what a week was. Especially, that was so surprising because in Adventism they're saying, well, God ordained a 7-day week. And then here's Adventist literature saying, well, but these groups, they don't even know what a week is, or they didn't have a 7-day week. The confusion and contradiction within this religion is just, it's utterly astounding. So Adventism defeats itself in its own literature by printing and giving me a list of nations who didn't even know what a week was or had something other than a 7-day week, but yet in their very same literature they said God ordained a 7-day week. Both of these statements can't be true, but in Adventism, there's that cognitive dissonance coming alive. Let's start here and look at this one. Signs of the Times from 1945. I love this one here. This one stands as a great example for what I was basically just saying. The weekly cycle of 7 days has been preserved through all past centuries and all past revisions and calendars with but few exceptions. So it's been totally preserved, but not totally preserved. And then they go on to say, well, Egypt for a short period of time adopted a 10-day weekly cycle. France for 13 years adopted a 10-day cycle. And Russia, in rebellion against God and religion, adopted a 5-day cycle for 5 years. This is Adventist doublespeak. Look at, the top portion here. They say the weekly cycle, it's been preserved through all ages and all times. And then in the second sentence, well, we got these countries here that didn't observe it at all. Great Adventist doublespeak. Let's continue. Let's look at this one on the top. Chinese paid no attention to the days of the... Chinese didn't even know what a week was. I thought this was God ordained, the 7-day week. Well, Chinese didn't know what it was. How about our next one here? Ancient Babylon, they had a 5-day work week. Egyptians, here we are again, 10-day. Romans, well, they had an 8-day calendar, and in some periods they had a 9-day calendar. How about this one, their lower right-hand corner, the Navajo Indians here in America? They didn't even know what a week was. So I started doing some other research. Before I get to that, remember this? I already showed this to you earlier. God ordained this weekly cycle to be preserved in unbroken succession, not only for time, but for eternity. I just showed you a few examples where that hasn't happened. Navajo Indians didn't even know what a week was. And countries like, well, Rome and Egypt, they had different weekly calendars. This Adventist God's a big failure. Let's continue here. How about Lakota Indians? They didn't know what a week was either, like their Navajo brethren. How about the nation of Bali? Oh, this one's great. This one's comical. There are 10 different concurrent weeks of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 days. They have weeks consisting of 1 day, weeks consisting of 3 days, weeks consisting of 10 days. This calendar must be just absolute maddening. Let's continue though. The Incas. The Incas had a 9-day-a-week calendar. Let's continue in Encyclopedia Britannica, who says, the original Julian calendar from Julius Caesar, if you watch the previous videos, you see the Julian calendar, Julius Caesar, they didn't even know what a week was. This is the very calendar that is the basis for the calendar that we have today, and it started out with no weekly divisions in it. How about this? The ancient Sumerians, they didn't even know what a week was. Let's go to Ghana, West Africa. They had a 6-day work week. How about, let's go backwards in time now, back to the ancient Near East, the Assyrians. They had a 5-day weekly calendar. I just showed you 14 countries, which either countries and people groups who didn't even know what a week was, or if they had a week in their calendar, it wasn't 7. It was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10. So if you're from Egypt, France, Russia, China, Babylon, Rome, a Lakota Indian, Bali, Inca, Sumerian, Ghana, or Syrian, the Sabbath was not made for you, Mark 2:27. You know what this proves? Look at this again. Look what Adventists teach. This is God ordained, this 7-day week. It's God founded. It's ordained by the Creator. It continues. It's never altered. Well, this Seventh-day Adventist God is a huge failure, because you just saw 14 cases where it was changed and or altered. The Seventh-day Adventist God, totally unable to keep his 7-day cycle in the world, because all these, I just showed you 14 examples where it didn't exist. And these are just the ones I could find. I could probably just keep searching, and that 14 could probably easily turn into 28 or 55. Adventism once again teaches as fact that which can be easily refuted, and just refuted now in this video. So much for the universal 7-day week and for the Sabbath given to mankind. If mankind doesn't even have a weekly calendar, this Seventh-day Adventist God is just an utter fool and a weakling. So the Adventist use, by the way, of Mark 2:27 is just, in this video here alone, has been proven completely wrong. The Sabbath wasn't given to mankind because a whole bunch of mankind didn't have a 7-day calendar that Adventists tell us their God promised, but we can just see now in the video their God couldn't follow through with the promise. So Adventism and its weak God are both failures. Get out of this false religion, Seventh-day Adventists, before it's too late.